Welcome to the solution. We need to define first of all our pub trade config with the associated types account ID, block number, nonce. The trade constraints are the same as we previously had with the pallet. Now another feature that got added is, so we've got this T, and this T is supposed to implement our config trade, and we now need to access it through T, double colon, and block number, and the same for all the other associated types here as well, and here. Now inside our tests we define the struct test config and implement our config for this test config. Here we, for example, set the account ID to string, block number to U32, and nonce to U32. Now instead of this long multiple generic arguments, we can now just say super pallet, and what kind of pallet? Well, our test config. That's our generic argument. And that's it. Now we can move on to main RS, where we needed to do a few tweaks. We had to implement the system config for our runtime and define what kind of types, for example, account ID, block number, and nonce are. Since we have this centralized types mod here, we defined that account ID can be found inside types, account ID, and block number inside types, block number, and nonce inside types, nonce. And here we reference this with self. So we pass in the runtime itself as a generic argument into our system palette. Why does this pattern matter? Well, instead of juggling 3, 4, or even 10 generic parameters, we abstract them behind one T config. Your code becomes easier to write, read, and maintain. Think of the config as the interface and runtime as the concrete configuration of your blockchain. These palette abstractions are what powers flexibility in Substrate. Before we move on to the next lesson, I'd like to talk about these lines of code here. So system config expects us to define what type account ID is, block number, and nonce, and it has certain constraints, certain boundaries. Anyways, what might be confusing here is we have this abstract type, and we point and assign another abstract type. So a lot of abstract types. What's going on here? Why don't we, for example, just write a string here and make it sweet, crisp, and short? Well, imagine you have a system config. Now you might have a balances config. Let's implement it quickly. And you might make the mistake that you define account ID not as a string, but let's say it's just a UH. I don't know, something. Doesn't matter. Now you have two types of account IDs inside your runtime system, and it just doesn't make sense. You want to have one type of account ID. The same applies for balances or nonces or everything. If it logically makes sense to just have one type for something, like balances, let's say that, then you should have a centralized storage for it. And in our case, the centralized point where we define the type is types account ID. So we go into types with here the mod types, and here's our centralized type store. And that's actually really, really nice. Now we can move on to the next step.